Hello, my name is Oliver Glanz and I'm a professor of Old Testament at the seminary at Andrews University. This tutorial is really for our partner schools and our affiliate schools that prepare their students for taking the Hebrew Qualifier at the seminary. So what I plan to do in this tutorial is to quickly show you what the content of the qualifier looks like so that you know what type of skills and what type of knowledge your students need to be able to bring to the test. The test consists of two parts. It consists of, here's actually the qualifier part, it consists of part number one. Here, particular Hebrew 1 knowledge is tested. And then after you've taken the part one, you're automatically going to part number two, where Hebrew 2 knowledge is tested. So you have to actually get at least 75% of the score, so 75 of 100 you have to get in the part 1 where we test Hebrew 1 knowledge in order to get access to the Hebrew 2 part, the part number 2. So if you do not get more than 75% in the first part, you won't get access to the second part, and you basically have to take a Hebrew 1 course. When you have enough points, that is more 75 or more, then you can open the second part. You can take the second part, and when you receive 75% or higher for the second part, you basically can opt out of taking Hebrew 2. Okay, good. So what are we actually asking in the Hebrew qualifier? Let's first have a look at the part 1. In part 1, as mentioned, we test basic Hebrew 1 knowledge, and here we have 4 different sections. The first section asks basic alphabetical questions. For example, you're presented with a couple of Hebrew letters, and you have to define the order, the ordering number of the alphabet. So think about Aleph is the first letter, so that would receive the number 1. Bet would be the second letter, so number 2. Dalet would be Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet, the 4th. So this is how that works. Next question asks you about final forms. So students need to identify whether there's a final form present or not. Well, Ayin doesn't have a final form, but P has, for example. Then we are asking about Begat Gefat letters. B is a Begat Gefat. Ayin is not a Begat Gefat, and this is how it goes on. Then we ask to identify Dagesh Lenes. So each of the dots need to be analyzed, and then the student needs to define whether one of the dots is actually a Dagesh Lene or not. So in this case, the first dot, if that would be Dagesh Lene, you would click here. If it's a second dot, you see red, well, then you would have to click here. Well, in this case, there are no Dagesh Lenes, and so on. In the 5th question, you are asked to identify vocal shvas. So if of the shvas there's none a vocal one, then you click that one. If the first one is a vocal one, then you click this one. Obviously, berit, this is a vocal shva. Then for the 6th question, you are asked to identify those kametzes that sound like an O. So that would be katev kametz or kametz katuf. And again here, katafta, so if there's one kametz that has an O sound, you would have to mark which one it is. Is it the first one? Is it the second one? Or is it actually none of them? So by Yakom, the first one, definitely not. The second one is. Okay, so these are the type of questions that you're asked in the alphabetic section. In the second section, you're asked basic syntactical questions that you treated in your Hebrew 1 course. So question number 7 then is the adjective used predicatively or is it used attributively? Well, in this case, you see they don't share definitiveness, so this is predicatively. The house is good, and some other examples or some other phrases or clauses are presented to you where you have to identify the adjective and you have to identify how the adjective functions. Then there are some translation questions that tackle construct relationships. Bet David, So a couple of translations are suggested, and you have to define which one is the correct answer. So bet melech, yeah, so you have to define which one is the correct answer. Then we get into the third section of the first part of the Hebrew qualifier. Here, basic questions about number and morphology are asked. So, for example, here you are presented with a couple of Hebrew numbers, and you have to define whether it's a cardinal or whether it's an ordinal number and which number it is. So sheni, well, is that second? Is that 2 or is it second, right? Or hamisha, is that 5 or is this 5th? So these types of questions you have to answer here. And then there's a whole section on morphology. So you see verbal morphology needs to be identified. So you get here, for example, yishtemuni, what is it? Yistemuni. So you have to define the person of the verb, the gender of the verb, the number of the verb. Then you need to define the conjugation, tense or aspect, depending on what terminology you have used in your class. We also provide a whole list of abbreviations in this qualifier course so that your students know what means. Stem, Kal, Nifal, Hofal, pronominal suffix. Well, here, for example, we have a pronominal suffix, so you define person, gender, and number, and then you identify whether there is a prefix element present. In this case, there's no element present, so you click on none. Good. So then we get into the noun section. In the noun section, we have the same game. You define the number of the noun, you define the state of the noun, you define whether there's a locative hey or directive hey present. For example, here we have a directive hey, so you would say it's present. Then you define whether you have pronominal suffixes involved, person, number, gender needs to be identified, and then again you also identify whether there are prefixed elements that you should be aware of. Here with Mitzrayma, there's none. And then in the final question here, you have to, the student has to know how prefixes are attached to words. So we provide you with nouns, for example, David, and then we want to prefix the, and so then you have a number of options. Only one is correct, so the student needs to choose which one is correct. And then move on. So for example, Edom, obviously we need the full Segol here, since we have a Katev Segol under the Aleph. Okay, so that's the third section, where we ask morphological questions. And then we go to the final section, that's the translation section. Here in the translation section, you are asked translation-oriented questions. Many of them have to do with syntax, identifying where clauses start, identifying phrases, subject, predicate, object phrases, and so on. So I will quickly run you through some of the questions so that you kind of get an idea of what type of questions your students need to answer. What do the words ish and eten have in common? So, and li, two, for me, there are 2 of daughters which not have known a man. Let me bring them out now, them to you. So the question is, ish and eten, what do they have in common? Well, are they both nouns? No, they are not. Are they both singular? Well, they are not. Are they all indefinite? Definitely not. You see the pronominal suffix. They all function as syntactical objects. To know a man, to bring them out. So what word is used in the construction eten? So here you need to know what et is presenting here. Is it the object marker or is it with? Obviously it's the object marker here. What word would you have to look up in the dictionary when subtracting from alechem its pronominal suffix? You would have to define which one would be the correct one. How many sentences, not clauses, how many sentences do you find in a text? So students need to know what the difference is between sentence and clause. and then they need to know how to count sentences and how to count clauses. So how many sentences do we find in text 1? To me are two daughters which have not known a man. So obviously this is one sentence consisting of two clauses. I bring them out, so we have two sentences. So sentence 1, li until ish. Second, utzia until alichem. How many clauses do you find in text A? Well, that would be 3, right? Because we have the relative clause in the first sentence. Of what type is the first clause? You see, it is a nominal clause or it is a verbal clause. Obviously, you have to understand what the difference between a verbal and a nominal clause are. Obviously, here we have a nominal clause. How many dependent clauses do we find in text A? So students need to know the difference between a dependent and independent clause. Obviously, we just have one. With which word does the last clause start? So again, you need to know where clauses, what are clause openers, where clauses are starting. So obviously, this is the first word, and you see you have to pick this up. Okay, so that's the first part of the qualifier. Basic Hebrew 1 knowledge is tested. Once they have received 75 or more points out of 100, they get access to the second part. So let us quickly run here through the second part. The second part consists basically just of a long text. Yeah, we have here text can be between 7 and 12 verses. The student needs to translate the entire text. All vocab that the student did not learn in Hebrew 1 or Hebrew 2 will be listed in the left. To make sure that your students know all words down to a frequency of 100. So if a word appears less than 100 times, then it is listed. Students are not allowed to take a dictionary into the qualifier. There is no assistance allowed. They only get access to a computer in the computer lab where they see exactly what I'm showing you right now. Obviously, I'm showing now a sample qualifier, not the real qualifier. Then in the first section, we are asked only translation-related, syntax-related questions. And I'll quickly run you here through the type of questions. How is the second word functioning syntactically? So obviously the second word here of verse 1, ha-he. And in the time to that, the question is, how does that syntactically function, the ha-he? What are the options? It functions as a syntactical subject. It functions as an attribute, as an apposition. It functions as a nominal predicate. Well, obviously it functions as an attribute here. With what word is the first relative clause in verse 1 starting? So again, you need to identify clause openers for both dependent as well as independent clauses. In verse 1, so you have these 4 options, and what word is the first relative clause in verse 1 starting? So that would be asher. And to whom do the pronominal suffixes used in verse 1 refer to? So obviously you have to define pronominal suffixes, and once you have defined the pronominal suffixes, you need to identify here the second person, amecha. You need to find out to whom they refer to. And there is no translation given, so it's really just the Hebrew words. What is the word with the opposite meaning, the antonym of deravon? Couple of options. So you can only make sense, you can only find the right answer if you actually have translated the text correctly. Then verses 2 till 3 describe quite graphically a geographical contrast. What is the geographical opposite to harakia? So obviously you have to, again, probably it's adamat, right? But you have to translate the text. What is the subject of the first clause? So here you are asked to identify phrases, and to know how to identify a subject phrase is central for this 6th question, verse 3. So where would be your subject of the first clause? Well, here we would have the subject. And again, you get these options. How does harabim behave syntactically to the preceding word? Is it a nominal predicate? Is it the final element of a construct chain? Is it an apposition? Or is it referring back to this word by means of the relative article. When you look at the last clause of verse 3, what describes best the nature of that clause? Last clause of verse 3. Well, that's a long clause, right? So it starts with yasiru. So this would be a verbal clause. Let's see. When you look at the last clause, so it's a verbal clause. So you see, you need to your students absolutely need to be able to identify clauses, clause beginnings, clause ends. What is the syntactical object of the first clause in verse 4? So you need to identify phrases, and here an object phrase. Who is the assumed subject? So in some cases we don't have explicit subject phrases, so now you need to find out, by means of your translation really, to whom the predicate refers to as a subject, what the implied subject is. There's one construct chain to be found in verse 4. What word does the chain begin with? So again, you have to translate and then define what word starts at the head of the construct chain. Compare the personal pronouns used in verse 4 and 5. They are different. To whom do they refer to? So the one in verse 4 refers to Daniel, while the one in verse 5 refers to Michael. Both refer to Daniel, and so on. So you have a couple of options. And obviously you cannot guess, because you really have to translate in order to find the answer. How would you best describe the rhetorical function of the beginning of verse 5? So let's look here at the beginning of verse 5. I, Daniel. So obviously we have emphasis going on. The first person is activated already with Ra'iti, but then we have Ani, and then the apposition Daniel. So let's see, we can say emphasizing the syntactical subject is the right answer here. A speech is introduced in verse 6. With what word does the actual direct speech start? Again, you need to translate. You need to know where clauses start. Vayomer la'ish levush asher. So it's quite a while actually until the direct speech starts, as you can see. Does the word ketz have definitiveness or not? To put it different, do you translate it with the article or without the in English? So obviously you have to translate and figure out whether it's in a construct relationship. If the last element has definitiveness, for example, proper name or an article, then this one would have definitiveness. Who is the assumed subject of the last clause in verse 7? Again, without translation, you're not able to answer this question. What do all predicates of verse 7 have in common? A couple of options. All of the predicates have different lexemes. Their forms share the same stem. For example, they're all kal or all nifal. They have the same actor as subject, implied as well as explicit. They continue the narrative sequence of actions initiated by Vayomer in verse 7. They are all nominal predicates, that is, predicate complements, and not verbal predicates. So translate, and then the right answer will be available to you. Now, this is the whole syntax section, and the student is expected to answer between 16 and 25 questions. Then in the morphology section, that's the second section, the morphology sections, the student is asked verbal forms that have appeared in the text that they just translated. So they have to analyze person, gender, number, conjugation, stem, the absence of a pronominal suffix is present here, so we would choose none. If it would be present, well, then 1, 2, 3, or gender and number need to be added as well. Are there prefix elements present? In this case, none. And so you just go through all the options here. And then we go to the last section of this second part of the qualifier. Here, again, morphological questions are asked, but this time regarding the nouns that appear in the text. So, number of the noun, state of the noun, whether there is a locative hey or not, whether there's a pronominal suffix present or not, and if it's present, what person, what gender, what number, and then pronominal suffixes. finish the attempt. And if you have received here 75% or more, then you have passed the qualifier and you don't have to take any Hebrew courses anymore. Hebrew 1 or Hebrew 2 are passed by passing the qualifier. So finally, let's bring this to an end. I just want to show you what information students have, and I'll send that on your request. I'll send those PDFs to you per email, or our secretary will do so. So there's a whole PDF on instructions and explanations, and you should print that out and give it to your students so that they kind of know how this whole thing works. Then there is an abbreviation PDF, abbreviations used in the qualifier. So here you have a list of abbreviations that we use in the qualifier. So they are all standard abbreviations, so your students should be fine, but to double check, make sure that you have your students covered on abbreviations. And then finally, there is a longer PDF that explains grammatical terminology that we assume you know, or your students know, when they come to the seminary. So here you have the grammatical term, for example, clause, verbal clause, normal clause, sentence, motive clause, object clause, predicate, subject, and so on. The terms are listed here, and then there is an explanation provided by my colleague Roy Gain, and then an explanation of my own, and then there is a reference to an explanation in the Biblical Hebrew Reference Grammar of Van der Merwe. So if Gain's explanation nor Glanzen's explanation is not really helping out, you can read paragraph 12.1 and 2 in order to get the explanation of what a clause is in the Biblical Hebrew Reference Grammar. Then I usually provide also an example, the Hebrew with its English translation. Then I provide, where possible, a screenshot of the feature I'm explaining here. For example, verbal clause. It contains a verb, Gain says. Glanz says a clause that has a finite verb functioning as a predicate. Then here an example, Vayar Lot and Lot saw. And then here from the Bible Online Learner, the analysis of the clause with conjunction phrase, predicate phrase, subject phrase. And if your student wants to get many more examples, he or she just has to click on this link and it will list all verbal clauses, in this case, that appear in the Hebrew Bible. So make sure that you run your students through this table and make sure that there are no questions left for them when they come over to the seminary to take the qualifier. Okay, this has been a long tutorial. Perhaps the last thing, when the students come here, they get free access, and they have registered for the qualifier, they get free access to a whole list of exercise materials, where they're trained on vocab, where they're trained on morphology, nominal morphology, verbal morphology, phrase analysis. All kinds of material is presented to them in the form of an exercise that helps them to really prep themselves for the qualifier. Okay, if you have any questions, feel free to contact the Old Testament department or myself, and we'll be happy to give you more information. Well, see you until next time. Bye.